Every champion has a secret, not the kind they share in post-game interviews or victory speeches, not the kind that gets printed on magazine covers or etched into trophy plaques. The secret I'm talking about is the one that lives behind the eyes, the one that never leaves, no matter how many medals hang from the wall. In 2016, a gold medalist stood on an Olympic podium and felt nothing. Not relief, not joy, not pride, nothing. And in the months that followed, he would later describe that moment as the beginning of the worst period of his life. He had spent 20 years chasing that single moment, and when it finally arrived, it was empty. His name was Michael Phelps. And his story is not the exception, it is the rule. There is a version of winning that the world shows you. It is loud and bright and full of confetti. There are cameras and crowds and the kind of noise that rattles your chest. And then there is what happens after the cameras turn off. That is where the real story begins. But to understand what victory costs, you first have to understand what it demands. And what it demands is everything. The science of elite performance begins in a place most people never see, deep inside the architecture of obsession. Researchers at the University of California, studying long-term athletic commitment, found that what separates elite performers from the merely excellent is not talent. It is not even work ethic in the traditional sense. It is the capacity to sacrifice things that ordinary people consider non-negotiable: sleep, relationships, identity, health. A 2019 study tracking Olympic-level athletes across 12 sports found that the average elite competitor begins serious training at age 6. By the time they reach their first major competition, they have spent more hours in their discipline than most adults spend with their own children across an entire childhood. The sport does not become part of their life. The sport becomes the container inside which all life happens. And inside that container, something else is being built, something that no one talks about when they hand you the trophy. In 1988, a sprinter named Ben Johnson crossed the finish line in Seoul and broke the world record for the 100-meter dash. The crowd erupted. The scoreboard froze on a number that seemed physically impossible: 9.79 seconds. Johnson raised his finger to the sky, and for 48 hours, he was the fastest human being who had ever lived. Then came the test results. Then came the press conference. Then came the silence. Johnson had been using stanozolol, an anabolic steroid. His gold medal was stripped. His record was erased. And the man who had spent his entire life becoming the fastest in the world was, overnight, transformed into a cautionary tale. What the world never fully processed is what happened next, because Johnson did not disappear. He kept training. He failed more drug tests. He was banned again and again. He spent the rest of his career chasing something he had already held in his hand and lost. The question that no one asked loudly enough was this: what had created the conditions in which a man would risk everything, including his legacy, for a medal? What had the system built inside of him that made the cost of losing feel worse than the cost of cheating? That question leads somewhere uncomfortable, and it starts long before Seoul. It starts in childhood. Developmental psychologists have identified what they call the identity foreclosure phenomenon, a state in which a young person commits so completely to a single identity that all other aspects of self-development are effectively frozen. In elite sports, this process is not accidental. It is engineered. Coaches, parents, academies, and institutions systematically reinforce the idea that the athlete is the performance, that the child is the result. The neurological consequences of this process are now becoming visible. Brain imaging studies conducted at Harvard Medical School have shown that young athletes who undergo intensive single-sport specialization before puberty exhibit altered development in the prefrontal cortex, the region of the medical school, brain responsible for identity formation, emotional regulation, and long-term decision-making. They are not simply trained, they are, in a measurable biological sense, reshaped. By the time these individuals reach elite competition, they carry with them a nervous system that has been calibrated to one purpose: win. And when winning is all you are, losing becomes something far more dangerous than disappointment. It becomes annihilation. But winning, actual winning, turns out to be its own kind of trap, and the mechanism of that trap is something that neuroscience is only beginning to fully map. When an athlete wins, the brain releases a cascade of dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine, a neurochemical flood that produces intense euphoria. But here is what the celebration circuit never advertises. The same system that generates that flood also recalibrates itself in the aftermath. The baseline shifts. What used to feel like success begins to feel like baseline. The threshold for satisfaction rises, and the athlete is left chasing a feeling that their own brain has made progressively harder to reach. This is not metaphor. This is biochemistry, and it explains why so many champions describe the period immediately following their greatest triumph not as joy, but as a void. Yelena Isinbayeva, Lance Armstrong, Tiger Woods, Naomi Osaka. Each of them, in different ways and in different sports, have described a version of the same experience. The summit was reached, and the summit was nothing like what they had imagined it would be. The mountain was supposed to be the answer. Instead, it was just another starting point for a descent they never trained for. What followed for each of them, the depression, the self-destruction, the withdrawal, the comeback attempts, was not weakness. It was the predictable output of a system that had never been designed to handle the thing it promised to deliver. And yet the machine keeps running. Because the machine is not built for the athlete. It is built around them. In 2003, a document surfaced from inside the East German sports program, one of the most systematically successful state-sponsored athletic machines in the history of competitive sport. The document was part of a broader archive that had been sealed since the fall of the Berlin Wall. Inside it were not training protocols or dietary plans. Inside it were psychological assessments, hundreds of them, detailed, clinical, and deeply revealing profiles of athletes who were being evaluated not just for physical capacity, but for psychological vulnerability. The East German system, officially known as the Staatssekretariat for Körperkultur and Sport, had developed a methodology for identifying which young people could be most effectively shaped into high-performance competitors. And the criteria were not what you would expect. They were not looking for confidence. They were not looking for resilience. In several documented cases, they were specifically selecting for certain kinds of insecurity. For children who had something to prove, for young people whose home environments had already created a hunger that sport could be used to feed, what the documents revealed was not simply a doping program. It was a psychological architecture, a deliberate construction of identity around performance. And the results, as measured in medals, were extraordinary. As measured in human cost, they were something else entirely. Former East German swimmer Christian Nakasummer, who won a bronze medal at the 1980 Moscow Olympics, later testified that she had been administered steroids beginning at age 13 without her knowledge or consent. By the time she understood what had been done to her, the damage was already permanent. Joint deterioration, hormonal disruption, and a relationship with her own body that she described as permanently broken. She had won. She just didn't know what she had paid. And here is where the story takes a turn that most people are not prepared for, because the East German system was not operating in isolation. It was operating in a context. A Cold War context in which sport had become a proxy battlefield, in which medals were not just symbols of athletic achievement, they were instruments of geopolitical signaling. Evidence presented to the world that one system of governance was superior to another. The athletes were not participants in that argument. They were the argument. This transforms the question of what winning costs, because the cost is not paid only by the individual, it is extracted, and the extraction is not random. It follows a pattern that can be traced across cultures, across decades, across entirely different sports, and entirely different political systems. In the 1990s, a series of investigations in the United States began to expose systematic abuse within elite gymnastics programs. The findings were disturbing not just for their content, but for their consistency. Coaches who controlled caloric intake, training environments that isolated young athletes from parents and support systems, a culture of silence enforced by the implicit threat that speaking would mean the end of a career that, by that point, had become synonymous with identity itself. What made the gymnastics investigations particularly revelatory was not the abuse itself, as horrific as it was. What was revelatory was the mechanism, the way the system had been constructed to make the athlete complicit in their own exploitation, the way they had been taught from childhood that pain was the price of greatness, that hunger was discipline, that dissociation was focus. By the time these young women reached the Olympic stage, by the time they stood in front of the world and performed feats that seemed to defy the limits of the human body, they had been trained not just to ignore pain, but to reinterpret it, to experience the warning signals of a body in distress as evidence that they were doing something right. The gold medal, in this context, was not the reward at the end of the journey. It was the proof of concept for a system of control. But there is another layer to this, one that exists not in the structures built around athletes, but inside the athletes themselves. Because not all of the damage is inflicted from the outside. Some of it is chosen, and the question of why someone would choose it is perhaps the most disturbing part of the entire story. In 2015, researchers conducted a study in which they presented elite competitive athletes with a hypothetical scenario. The scenario was simple. A performance-enhancing substance would guarantee that you win your most important competition. The substance would shorten your life by 5 years. Would you take it? More than half said yes. When the study was repeated with a modified version, the substance would guarantee victory in every competition for the next 5 years. Then kill you. The percentage who said yes barely changed. What this data reveals is not moral failure. It is something more fundamental. It is the logical endpoint of a value system that has been installed with such precision and depth that it overrides survival instinct. These athletes were not irrational. They were operating perfectly within the framework that had been built for them, a framework in which winning was not one value among many. It was the only value, the terminal value, from which all others were derived. And that framework did not emerge from nowhere. It was constructed deliberately, systematically, and over the course of decades. And it was constructed not by villains, but by people who believed in what they were building, coaches who genuinely loved their athletes, parents who genuinely wanted success for their children, institutions that genuinely believed they were developing excellence. The horror of the story is not that it was built by monsters. The horror is that it was built by believers. Now, we arrive at what might be the most unsettling dimension of this entire architecture, the part that extends beyond the locker room, beyond the training facility, beyond the athlete and the coach and the system, the part that involves you. Sports psychology researchers have identified a phenomenon they call parasocial identification, a state in which a viewer or fan develops a sense of personal identity connection to an athlete or team. Brain imaging studies have confirmed that fans watching their team compete show activation patterns in the same neural regions associated with personal threat and personal triumph. When your team wins, your brain processes it as a survival win. When they lose, it processes it as a survival loss. This means that the athlete's performance is not simply entertainment. It is, for millions of people, a form of emotional outsourcing. We appoint these individuals to carry our need for triumph on our behalf. We load them with the weight of our own frustrated ambitions, our own hunger for significance, our own fear of being ordinary. And then we watch, and we are grateful when they win. And we are disappointed, sometimes viciously so, when they lose. And we rarely stop to ask what that dynamic does to a person who has been trained from childhood to derive their entire sense of worth from our approval? The answer, it turns out, is documented in clinical literature. Athletes who retire from elite competition show rates of depression, anxiety, and substance abuse that are statistically comparable to trauma survivors. Not because their sport was traumatic, though it often was, but because the cessation of performance removes the only framework within which they have learned to understand themselves. They are not athletes who retired. They are identities that were erased. Football players who spent 15 years absorbing physical punishment for the approval of stadiums full of strangers now find that the strangers have moved on to the next player. The roar that once felt like proof of existence is now directed elsewhere. And the body that carried them to that roar is now paying its invoice in joint damage, neurological degradation, and pain that will persist long after the last highlight reel has been archived. The NFL's own data, released as part of ongoing concussion litigation, indicates that former players suffer from chronic traumatic encephalopathy, a progressive neurological disease caused by repeated head trauma at rates that were, for years, systematically obscured. Former players were experiencing mood disorders, memory loss, and personality changes. Some of them were dying in ways that could not be explained by anything other than the damage accumulated in service of the game. Junior Seau, Aaron Hernandez, Dave Duerson. These were not isolated tragedies, they were data points, and the data tells a story about a system that extracted everything it could from human beings and then, when the extraction was complete, released them into a world they were entirely unprepared to inhabit. The question that the data generates is not whether we knew, the question is whether knowing would have changed anything. Because the evidence suggests that even fully informed athletes, fully informed fans, and fully informed institutions continue to make the same choices. The machine does not require ignorance to operate. It operates perfectly well in broad daylight. Which brings us to the final, and perhaps most haunting, dimension of this story. In ancient Rome, the gladiatorial games were not simply entertainment, they were a form of social management. The crowds that filled the Colosseum were not only watching men fight for their lives, they were participating in a ritual that reinforced social hierarchy, discharged collective aggression, and demonstrated the power of the state over individual human existence. The gladiator who survived long enough became a celebrity, a figure of mass adoration, and some of them, the most successful ones, became extraordinarily wealthy. But the system itself was not designed for their benefit. It was designed for the benefit of the audience, and for the benefit of the powers that organized the audience. 2,000 years later, the architecture is almost identical. The aesthetics have changed. The explicit violence has been sublimated into legal contact sports and formalized competition. The crowds no longer watch from stone amphitheaters. They watch from screens in their living rooms, from seats in corporate-sponsored stadiums, from sports bars where the drinks are priced, to exploit the emotional state that the game creates. But the underlying structure, the selection of specific individuals to perform physical excellence for the emotional satisfaction of a population that will never perform at that level, has not changed in any fundamental way. What has changed is the scale, and what has changed is the sophistication of the mythology that surrounds it. We no longer speak of gladiators, we speak of heroes, we speak of inspiration. We speak of the triumph of the human spirit, and these are not entirely wrong. What elite athletes achieve is genuinely extraordinary. The dedication required is real. The sacrifice is real. The triumph is real. But the myth that has been constructed around that reality, the myth that victory is pure, that champions are made simply by wanting it badly enough, that the system rewards excellence with happiness and meaning, that myth is the most dangerous product the machine produces, because it obscures the cost. It hides the wreckage behind the trophy. It turns the survivor's testimony into a motivational speech and buries the non-survivors beneath the next season's highlights. And it ensures that the next generation of 6-year-olds will begin their journey toward the podium without any accurate map of what that journey will require of them, without any honest accounting of what waits at the summit, They will be told that victory is worth it. And in some senses, for some of them, it may be, but they will not be told what it costs. Because the machine cannot afford that conversation, the machine needs the next recruit to believe, as completely and as early as possible, that the prize at the end justifies the price of the journey. And so, the cycle continues. Not because anyone is deceiving anyone with malicious intent, but because the system has created incentives that make honesty structurally inconvenient. Coaches need winning athletes. Programs need winning seasons. Sponsors need winning brands. Broadcasters need winning narratives. And winners need to believe that winning was worth it because the alternative is a confrontation with a cost that cannot be unpaid. This is what makes it so difficult to change. Not the bad actors, not the corrupt officials, not the doping programs or the abusive coaches, as serious as each of those problems are. What makes it difficult to change is that the machine works. By the only metric it uses to measure itself, it works extraordinarily well. It produces champions. It produces records. It produces moments of genuine human excellence that are genuinely transcendent. It simply also produces, as a consistent and predictable byproduct, a specific category of human damage. And that damage is priced into the system. It has always been priced in. The question is, who pays it? And the answer, almost without exception, is the same people who believed most completely in the promise. Michael Phelps, the most decorated Olympian in history, 23 gold medals, 28 total, has spoken publicly about the suicidal ideation he experienced in the aftermath of his competitive career. Not during the difficult moments, after the victories, in the silence that followed everything he had ever worked for. He has since become an advocate for mental health awareness in athletics. He uses the platform that the machine gave him to try to illuminate the cost that the machine conceals. It is, in its way, a beautiful and courageous response to an impossible situation, but it also raises a question that neither he nor anyone else has fully answered. If we truly knew, with full clarity, what the path to that podium required, how many of us would still build the system that sends children down it? How many of us would still watch? How many of us would still cheer? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, if the answer is yes, if we would still build it, still watch it, still cheer, what does that tell us about what we are actually celebrating when the gold medal is placed around a champion's neck? Victory is real. The price is real. And somewhere between the two, in the space that the machine fills with noise and light and the roar of crowds, is a truth that has been waiting quietly for someone to ask the right question. The question is not whether winning is worth it. The question is, worth it to whom?